The year is 2020. I recently bought a new gaming laptop, and to test it out I bought the Resident Evil 2 remake for cheap on Steam. I didn't think much of it, but I always knew about the franchise, and until then I was exclusively a console gamer, so I thought why not test out this new laptop with this game. Well, turns out it ran like shit, but looking back on that was probably my fault because I really wanted to play the game on the higher settings to make it look nice, while it probably would have worked fine on the lower settings. But my stupidity at the time is a bit besides the point, because after getting tired of all the frame drops, or my laptop getting very warm, as laptops do, I remembered that I had the Resident Evil 1 remake in my PlayStation library thanks to PlayStation Plus. And since I was really set on playing an RE game at this point, I thought I'd install that one. My girlfriend, who I just started dating a few months back, was also really interested in the series, but she didn't want to play them herself as she's not that into horror, and third-person shooters don't really interest her, so she just wanted to watch and see what the story was about. And playing the game together like that sounded like a really nice way for us to spend time together. There were no real expectations though, no plans to get further into the series besides for maybe a few of the popular entries, no plans to even complete both campaigns of Resi 1. I was just curious what all the fuss was about, and so I booted up.
Resident Evil.
Fast forward 6 years though, and it's 2026. I just rolled credits on the Village DLC, and in this time I played all of the mainline titles, including story DLCs Code Veronica 0 and both Revelations games, right on time for Requiem. At this point, it's pretty safe to say that this franchise has become one of the all-time favorites of mine, and of my girlfriend, who stuck with me for basically the whole journey. And in this video, I wanted to take a look back at that journey, looking back at all the highs and lows, and just chat a bit about this franchise that has come to mean so much for me. But let's start at the beginning, with Resident Evil 1, the PS4 re-release of the remake to be exact. And to this day, this is an extremely special game to me. When someone asks me, what is your favorite Resident Evil game? This will always be the first one that I think about. Even now, this game just perfectly encapsulates Resident Evil to me. I absolutely adore how it's structured with the Spencer Mansion, how the entire game is built around it, how you keep unlocking new parts of it, the atmosphere that's just beaming out of every single pre-rendered background. This location is genuinely perfect and one of my all-time favorite game settings. I'll always remember first entering this place. Having played the Jill campaign first, it was her, Wesker, and Barry looking for Chris. Wesker immediately became a highlight for me and my girlfriend, because look at him. Like, who wears sunglasses not only at night but inside of this dark-ass mansion? Little did we know how relevant his character would become, but I love this opening and everything that followed. That wild journey to uncover all of this place's secrets, visiting the surrounding areas, encountering Lisa Trevor, and reading all of the lore notes, which all started with that first iconic zombie encounter. And talking about zombies, they were easily another highlight for me. It might sound stupid out of context, but I love how they are an inherent part of this mansion's design, rather than just enemies that roam around. Some rooms have them, others don't, and since every room is its own area separated by loading screens, they would also stay in those rooms. If you kill a zombie, the body will stay there. If you'd rather save ammo and leave them alive, well, you'll have to avoid them for the rest of your playthrough. Mapping out the mansion like this and establishing my preferred route to make my way around was incredibly fun and satisfying. But with it being a horror game, they obviously had to spice it up at some point, which is where the Crimson Heads come into play. Because at a certain point, all of the zombies that you killed will be revived stronger than before. The first time we ran into them was such a memorable moment. I just remember the confusion and tension when we heard a zombie in a place that we knew was cleared out, only to then realize what Crimson Heads were, making us go around and burn old bodies to prevent more of them from waking up. The puzzles were another highlight, not only because they were just really fun, but also because of how we went about them during our playthrough. Because since my girlfriend was just watching, she obviously didn't have that much to do during the combat, outside of backseat gaming and hiding behind a plushie. But the puzzles were her time to shine, theorizing together about where we could use which item, which area would be unlocked next, or when we got stuck she would go to the wiki and drop small hints to push me back on track. The story was also really cool with Jill and Chris both having a campaign. At this point, by the way, having loved one campaign so much, we both really wanted to go through it again with Chris, and it was really interesting to see all of the changes. Like, suddenly Rebecca was a character, and on another playthrough it was also really cool to see how your gameplay can affect the story, in terms of which characters will make it out of the mansion alive, even if the later games kinda brush that aside, with the canon just being that everyone survived. The canon with this game in general is a bit weird, to be honest, because both campaigns also contradict each other in like very small details, but the canon is just the general events that went down at the mansion, which was a bit weird at first, but it works surprisingly well. I just have so many fond memories of Resident Evil 1, it's genuinely a 10 out of 10 for me. After this we took a little break though. We were very obviously gonna continue our journey with a sequel, but I just rarely binge franchises, mostly to avoid burnout, but also because otherwise my experiences and memories kinda start to blend together after a while. But eventually it was time for the Resident Evil 2 remake, which I also played on PlayStation. I guess I could have gone back to my Steam copy, but playing it on the big TV in a dark room is a lot nicer, and it also gave me an excuse to expand my physical gaming collection. But Resident Evil 2 Remake was another gem of a game. I personally don't like it as much as Resident Evil 1, but it is my girlfriend's favorite entry. I think personally I was just so enamored by the mansion, the mystery surrounding it, the pre-rendered backgrounds, and it was also our first experience, so I might be a bit biased. I know that the original Resident Evil 2 has pre-rendered backgrounds as well, but I didn't play that one yet. Call me a fake fan, but until now I mostly only played the remakes, but I'll touch on that remake original situation later in the video. Getting back to Resident Evil 2 though, while it is not my absolute favorite, it is undoubtedly a fantastic game. This one is structured very similarly to RE1, with the two campaigns to focus on one location, the combat and the puzzles, but also having a bunch of new elements like a stalker enemy, and everything that I loved in the first game I also loved here. I adore the police station. I don't know how they made two games back to back with 10 out of 10 locations and map layouts. I love how they spice things up with Mr. X showing up constantly. Sometimes it was scripted, sometimes he was just there, which made me run around the entire station to get away from him while finding a different route to get to my destination. And even if the remake has a third-person over-the-shoulder camera, the game still has a really strong atmosphere. The combat was also pretty fun, and the inventory management is perfect. That's something that I didn't really mention with RE1, but these early games struck a perfect balance with the amount of ammo and resources that you had. The story here was another really big highlight for me, even more so than in RE1. What I've noticed is that the remakes really put a heavy emphasis on story and character, and that is something that I do really love. Claire and Leon were both incredible. I love Ada and how she was such a mystery at first, but how she and all of the other characters are also really fleshed out to feel human and grounded. RE2 Remake is just incredible, easily a top tier game, and especially a top tier Resident Evil. We were 2 games in now, we loved both a lot, so as soon as we finished our second campaign in this game, we immediately ordered RE3. And while this one is very controversial on the internet, we personally did enjoy our time with it. It's definitely the weakest of the games we played at that point, and I really wish it was more fleshed out, but that doesn't mean that this is a bad game. In comparison to the original, it might be a bad remake, but as an experience on its own, as someone who is just playing through the series, picking it up for very cheap a while after launch, this was a pretty fun time, especially with all of the Nemesis set pieces, and I also really liked the story here. Bringing back Jill, introducing Carlos, the first of many characters that will just show up for one game only for then Capcom to forget about them, which is probably one of my biggest criticisms of the series, but I'll touch back on that a few times. I also really like that we got this grand finale for Raccoon City. It feels a bit silly saying that now, with Requiem literally going back there, but you know what I mean. It was cool to explore the city, and having all of these outdoor locations was a really nice change of pace. This was also the first game to kind of shift the focus over to action gameplay, even if it definitely still keeps some survival horror aspects. But because of that shift, my girlfriend was a bit less involved here. Thankfully though, with all of the set pieces and story moments happening in quick succession, it was still really fun for us to share this experience. And at this point, I feel like it was also pretty obvious that we were dedicated to playing through at least all of the numbered titles, so instead of moving on to RE4, we actually went back and played Resident Evil 0. Also because at this point I really wanted Resident Evil 1 physically in my collection, and the physical release of it came bundled with RE0, so we might might as well play that one next. But this was the first game that we both didn't really vibe with. I wouldn't call it bad, as it did have a lot of things that we liked. It goes back to the RE1 engine, so I loved the pre-rendered backgrounds and the atmosphere. We also really liked the main duo of Rebecca and Billy, but besides that, this game was kind of We liked the main characters and their story, but the actual narrative never really hit. The locations felt really awkward with Another Mansion, but this one just felt like a cheap attempt to capture that same energy, and the train really sucked, as there was not enough room to do anything. I kinda get what they were going for, but at the same time, they also changed the inventory system and got rid of the item boxes, which made everything just really awkward. I always ended up just creating my own item box, since items never despawn, so I would just throw everything into the main hall. This game also had some really annoying sections because you would have to switch between playable characters all the time, and the game would constantly split you up from your partner, with the goal just being to get back together. It just kind of felt like a weird game that was made to probably just give some extra backstory to Rebecca right before she ended up in Resi 1. And while we didn't actively dislike it, this is definitely one of the weaker games, even if it had its moments. And after that, we played Resident Evil 4, the original, as the remake wasn't out yet. But I do really like that we got to play the original, and where 3 had a decent mix of action and survival horror, 4 went all in on the action. Because of this, during gameplay sections, the game turned into second monitor content for my girlfriend, but she was still really locked in during the story, and we were constantly discussing it and stuff, so it's not like she wasn't involved at all. Quite the opposite, actually. And we both really loved this game, especially since we were both really big Leon fans, big Ada fans, and this game also introduced Ashley, who we both really grew to love. I found out later that a lot of people hate Ashley in the original, but we both thought she was just really fun. I thought it was really funny that she was constantly screaming for Leon's help 24/7, and I just thought that they had a fun dynamic. But this game, in general, was just really fun. It has a cool story, it's really funny, mostly because of Leon.
No way, Leon.
Way.
Most of the areas are also really solid, the combat is fun even if it's a bit over-reliant on quick-time events, and outside of that last part, the game has actually aged surprisingly well, considering that it's like 20 years old. Obviously we played a remaster, but you know, it's not a remake or anything, and in that regard it aged very well. At this point, this was also the longest game in the series, but it didn't really overstay its welcome either. And I'm honestly really surprised with how Resident Evil this game feels, despite being so different. It's super action heavy, you're constantly doing backflips and kicking zombies in the face, throwing around stupid one-liners in a random village somewhere on a mission for the president to save his daughter, but this game still felt like Resident Evil to me, which I really appreciated. This game did make me think of another part of the series as a whole that I'm not too big a fan of though, because last time we saw Leon, he was leaving Raccoon City, and the next time we see him in the mainline title, he's suddenly working for the president. At the time I was kind of disappointed that we didn't get the next chapter of Leon's story, but instead we got another Leon story. Nowadays I kinda made peace with that though. In this era of the series, Resident Evil was more about random events in the lives of these characters, rather than telling the full story of these characters, but I feel like that was my biggest issue with the game at the time. Besides that, I really loved it. At the time this was easily a top 3 Resident Evil game. Resident Evil 1 followed by 2, and then this one. I say top 3 Resident Evil games like that's some kind of crazy impressive achievement, but at this point I literally only played 4 other games. I mean, it's meant as high praise, so just take it like that, okay? This game is fantastic, it's cool, it's awesome, I really loved it. Top 3 Resident Evil games. But here, we did reach a hurdle. Resident Evil 5. Look, okay, this game isn't bad, but it is kind of just mediocre. They took the action formula for Resident Evil 4 and took it even further, to the point that it kind of started to lose that RE feeling for me. This felt more like a generic action horror game with Resident Evil characters rather than a real Resident Evil game. This is a balance that 4 was able to nail, but here I feel like they kind of overshot it a bit. It was really fun to play in co-op though. You would think that I played with my girlfriend since she was with me for this whole whole journey, but she really didn't want to play it since she's not that into this type of gameplay, so we roped a good friend of ours into this journey, and playing it together with us three was honestly the highlight of this game. That and the fact that this game is really goofy as a result of how over the top it is, especially all of the absurd encounters with Wesker. But outside of that, I wasn't really feeling this game. The gameplay didn't feel great, a lot of the boss fights and their quick time events were pretty annoying and tedious. Sheva was the latest character for Capcom to forget about, and to be honest, I also kinda forget about her because she's not that much of a character. But again, despite my issues, it was really fun to play in co-op. There were some great moments here, and while the game itself might be kind of mid, I look back at it fondly because of the co-op and because of the fun way that we did manage to play this game. And then technically, the next game would have been Resident Evil 6, but since that game looked like freaking Avengers Endgame judging by the cover art, and since we also know that RE7 was a sort of soft reboot, we thought, we're in this deep, so we might as well play all of the other spin-offs before 6, because when else would I play them? Which brought us to Code Veronica X. And I'm really glad that I played this, because honestly, this should have been a mainline numbered title. It also addressed the issue that I had with Resident Evil 4, because this game perfectly continues the story of Chris and Wesker from Resident Evil 1 and Claire's plotline directly from Resident Evil 2, setting them up perfectly for their future appearances. But also on its own, it is just a really great story with an intriguing hook. There are also some new faces here with Steve and the villains. Steve was pretty funny and had some great moments, even if he was kind of a weird guy, but the villains were the real weird guys here, because they kind of got a bit too weird for my liking. I can see what they were trying to do with them, but they were probably the weakest part of this game for me, until Wesker shows up, who then carries the villain aspect of this game once again. So in the end, it was all pretty solid. Gameplay-wise, this is also a really strong title using the classic structure from Resident Evil 1 and 2, and as much as I loved 4, it was really nice to get back to that classic Resident Evil structure. Which actually makes a lot of sense, by the way, because originally this game was released between Resident Evil 3 and 4. It just sounds a bit silly right now because I didn't play them in that order. But because it released back then, it is definitely aged. It aged quite a bit even, but it also holds up thanks to its really strong gameplay loop. It's a really great survival horror game. The setting was also really good with the island, and the game was also pretty scary, both because of the atmosphere, but also because I knew that you could get yourself soft-locked in this game if you weren't careful. So to avoid that, I did use a guide at points, and my girlfriend was once again very involved here and dropping hints. It was just a really fun time. In terms of remakes though, I kind of want to mention this with Code Veronica, because I have spoken on the channel before about how they kind of need to remake Code Veronica next. Not because I think this game needs a remake, it's already one of the best games in the franchise for me, but it's undeniable that a bunch of people are gonna be turned off from this game because of its age. Also because the remakes are so successful, so they're obviously gonna keep remaking Resident Evil games, and if that is the case, Code Veronica absolutely deserves it, and probably needs it the most compared to the other games, especially because of how good this story is, and with the remakes having a tendency of focusing on the narrative, cleaning up some connections, making the character arc smoother between games, and just fleshing out the characters even more. Also outside of that, with the strengths that this game already has, I feel like this could really be one of the best games in the series, or just one of the best survival horror games in general, if a remake is done properly. And talking about remakes done right, at this point in the timeline we reached the release of Resident Evil 4 Remake, and in the very beginning of this video I said, if someone asks me, what is your favorite Resident Evil game? The first game that always comes to mind is Resident Evil 1. But I will often correct myself afterwards, because my actual favorite Resident Evil game is the RE4 Remake. It might not be the ultimate Resident Evil experience, as the survival horror aspect is a core pillar to this series for me, and Resident Evil 1 still takes that spot, but this game is my favorite game in the franchise, if that makes sense. One of them is the peak of survival horror RE, and the other one is the peak of action horror RE. The gameplay is just incredibly fun. I love the melee combat system that they added. I I adore the environments and the updated locations that feel like the original, but also feel new and improved upon. I love the story, which takes that original but expands on it. It expands on the characters, on the world. In a lot of ways, this game does feel quite different. It's faithful, don't get me wrong, it truly feels like Resident Evil 4, but it feels like a fresh take on that game. Keeping the essence, keeping that core, but improving on so many things. Fleshing out characters like Krauser, Lewis, or Ashley, giving us incredible moments for Leon and Ada, showing the real impact of the virus on our main cast. I also really like how they made this Leon feel like even more of a continuation of RE2 Leon, going a long way into fixing that issue that I had with the original. Like, obviously there is still a pretty big jump, but the jump from RE2 to RE4 feels a lot more natural here. He's also just so fucking cool, like how can you not love him? I cannot praise this game enough. It is a downright masterpiece of a game, a masterful remake. This is a treatment that I would want for Code Veronica. It's fleshed out, they ironed out the flaws and made the peaks reach even higher heights. But it also doesn't aim to replace that original. Both experiences can still stand incredibly strong on their own. Each one offers a different flavor of Resident Evil 4, and both complement each other. And despite being very action-oriented, my girlfriend was also pretty involved here once again, driven by her love for Leon Kennedy, with this one becoming her second favorite RE game. But after we were done with that game, we ventured back into the weird era of Resident Evil that started with 5, as I played the Resident Evil Revelations games next. And these games really feel like they knew that the mainline titles were venturing a bit too far into the action, so they created these spin-off games to satisfy the survival horror fans of the series. But at the same time, they also didn't want to alienate the fans who were expecting horror games, and at the same time again, these were also spin-off titles, so they tried a lot of new and weird and experimental things here, like the first game being on the 3DS, and the second one being episodic, which turned Revelations into this really weird hybrid experimental thing that ultimately didn't really work for me. Don't get me wrong, I don't dislike these games, I appreciate them for what they were trying to achieve, and they definitely have some strong elements. I liked the boat setting of Revelations 1, I liked the personal story of Barry in Revelations 2, but these games didn't really hook me. They were kind of a drag, they felt a bit uninspired, the atmosphere and gameplay was really lacking. These games kind of just made me miss the golden age of Resident Evil. I was kind of forcing myself through these, thinking like, damn man, what happened to this series? It felt lost. They even tried something really stupid here by introducing Alex Wesker, the kind of sister to Albert Wesker, which really made it clear to me that they were just trying to recapture what once was. It felt really desperate even to just introduce a new Wesker right after you killed off Albert in Resident Evil 5. And after this was Resident Evil 6. Another chapter in this weird saga of Resident Evil, and this is the only game in the series that I actively dislike. The game has terrible pacing and just dragged on and on. It had a bunch of returning characters, but a lot of their stories were just jumping from point A to point B rather than being an actual character arc. It's also trying to do way too much at once, having like 4 different campaigns, and the worst part for me is that there was actually so much potential here. I like parts of this game, but it's all conceptual or scenes in a vacuum. The end of the Chris campaign, for example, was pretty good, and I like the concept behind Cherry coming back from Resident Evil 2. They once again tried to bring back Wesker in some way, this time through his son, Troy Baker. I mean Jake Wesker. We just kept calling him Troy Baker during our playthrough because his character felt painfully generic, and he's obviously voiced by him, but I did like the idea of his character, all of that stupid inside jokes aside. He's just trying to do the right thing despite everyone looking at him in a negative way as the son of Albert Wesker. But concepts like that need a focused narrative that can actually explore them as grounded characters, rather than just throwing this insane concept into this convoluted mess of a game that has like 20 equally, if not more, insane concepts and storylines going on. Even in gameplay, this game just felt messy, buggy, and just an overall downgrade from Resident Evil 5. With a cover system that barely worked, even more quicktime events, terrible level design, it's just not a good game. I'm sorry. The thing that pissed me off the most, though, is the freaking meeting between Leon and Chris, because this was the first game in the series to feature both of them. 2 of their flagship characters sharing exploring a game together for the first time. The trailers had this insane shot of both of them meeting and holding each other at gunpoint. I called Resi 6 Avengers Endgame earlier, but nah, this was actually Civil War judging by the trailers. Only for all of that to be nothing. They just run into each other, exchange a few blows, and then they're like, "Oh hey Leon, what are you doing here?" And I was just sitting there in awe, mouth agape, because what do you mean, "Oh hey Leon"? These two know each other? Like, what do you mean these two know each other? How did these two characters meet off screen and then they act like this in their first shared on-screen appearance? In the grander scheme of things, this is probably the least of this game's worries though, but that moment really stuck out to me during my playthrough that I just had to mention it, because me, the friend that I played it with, and my girlfriend were all just shocked at the fact that they just knew each other somehow, and that it's also not even shown in any of the movies or side media as far as I know. I don't want to be too negative for this video though, so to bring it back to something nice, I am really glad that this game had co-op. I played it with the same friend that I played Resident Evil 5 with, and being able to experience this mess together did make it kind of funny at points. We had a bunch of inside jokes like Troy Baker that I mentioned earlier, but also Fada Wrong and Leon's final line just being
Women.
Nobody watching this video is gonna get any of those jokes, but that was just really funny for us. So I'm gonna think back on Resident Evil in a positive light in that way. I'll give him that. But I am glad that Capcom definitely knew that the series had strayed too far from what it used to be, because Resident Evil 7 was a clear back to basics soft reboot, which was very good news for my girlfriend, because during this whole era of mid-action games, it stayed on the second monitor for her. But now it was 2025 and we were back to the big TV in a dark room, getting immersed in the story of Ethan Winters. But as a soft reboot, this game did take some getting used to, especially since it was actively trying to distance itself from the established universe, and it also kind of ditched all of the action. But as we were getting deeper into the game, especially after the DLC, it became very clear what Resident Evil 7 was trying to do. This game might not scream Resident Evil, but it truly and deeply understands the golden age of the series, and it was molding that core into a new experience. There is a lot that this game does masterfully. The Baker residence is an obvious highlight. It has a great atmosphere. I really like how they brought back the stalker enemies for some areas as well, and it has some memorable characters. But there are also some things that didn't really click with me, mostly the normal enemies, because I didn't really like the molded, as they were just really tanky, and while the map was structured similarly to the Resident Evil 1 mansion, the molded here didn't really feel like a part of that map, but more like random enemies that would just spawn in. I also wasn't a big fan of Ethan Winters himself, as he was just kind of a nothing character. I get what they were trying to do with him, he was very much just a vessel for the player with minimal character himself, but this series has always had some really strong protagonists, so I did miss that here. I also wasn't too fond of how Chris was just used as a cameo in the end, and I really didn't like his design. Like, bro, if you did not say your name, I would not have known that you were Chris Redfield. But thankfully the DLC did fix that. Not the design part, but they actually gave him something to do and some relevance to the main story, which I really appreciated. The base game almost feels like a spin-off to the series because it's so disconnected, but the DLC definitely takes care of that and establishes a stronger connection. But even with all of these criticisms, this is undoubtedly a great game. I loved my time with it. I don't love it as much as Resident Evil 1, 2 or 4, but it does rank pretty highly, and I was really happy to see that the series has found its footing again. And Resident Evil Village was a really strong follow-up to that. I honestly even prefer it over 7, but it also makes me appreciate 7 even more. It's a direct continuation, and it addresses a lot of the criticisms that I had of it. Where that game took the franchise completely back to the basics and focusing completely on horror, Village takes the next step into that process by bringing back the action elements, taking a lot of very clear inspiration from 4 especially. So playing this game made me feel right at home. I especially love the structure of it, with the village itself being a fantastic hub which connects to all of these other domains. And I like how different all of these domains are, even if some of them are definitely better than others. You have stuff like the castle with a really strong gameplay loop and a great atmosphere. Structurally it was very clearly inspired by Resident Evil 1 or 2, but because it was only a small part of this game, it was pretty short and it was also pretty shallow in comparison as a result. result. But then you also have domains like the dollhouse, which was perfect. This is the scariest that Resident Evil has ever been. It was tense, disturbing, and it perfectly interwove story sections into that entire segment. This was probably the best part of the entire Ethan Winters saga, and it might be one of the best sequences in the entire franchise. I also really like the story of Village. The pacing is a bit weird because it's extremely backloaded, but when stuff was happening, I was really into it. And I really love what they did with Ethan's character. I went from not caring about him at all to him being a fantastic addition to the rest of the RE cast. But Chris was handled a bit awkwardly here. Also, why the fuck was Chris in so many games back to back? Like Resident Evil 5, 6, 7, and now 8. I'm glad he's resting for 9, but that was a really random side note. His character was handled a bit awkwardly here, mostly because of that weird pacing. Ultimately, his arc does work for me, it makes sense for his character and he has some fantastic moments, but the execution of it was pretty flawed. But while I loved this game, my girlfriend kind of checked out around the Lady Dimitrescu fight because it was getting a bit too fantastical with the vampires and stuff. So it took us a while to finish this game because she never felt like playing it until she just decided that, you know what, you can play this game on your own and just give me like the TLDR later. And then I beat it in the next few days or whatever, but I can definitely see where she was coming from. While the gameplay made me feel right at home, those aspects also didn't immediately click with me. And since the game only really delves into the story at the end, it also took me a while before I got what they were trying to do. The early hours of this game were really weird because we were both very hesitant about where they were seemingly taking this story, but thankfully the game did really lock in at the end, and I really liked the whole conclusion to this story. I think they did a really good job at tying it all up nicely, which made me appreciate the whole experience a lot more in hindsight, and this game then also really clearly marks the end of the Ethan Winters saga. And while this is definitely a bit of a different flavor of RE, in a franchise with this many titles, I appreciate that they weren't afraid to shake things up. But most importantly, I like that for this saga that they kept the core of the series intact. Resident Evil 5 and 6 were also not afraid to shake things up, but there I feel like they were shaking it violently with a lot of core elements just falling off of it, while here they carefully established a new but faithful direction for the series to go. To end this section of the video though, I wanted to give a quick ranking of all of the games that I played, because throughout the video I would sometimes say, oh, this is a top tier Resident Evil game, this is a top 3 Resident Evil game at the time, but now that I'm at the end of my journey, this is how I would rank them. In last spot, Resident Evil 6, followed by Resident Evil 0, Revelations, 5, Revelations 2, 3, Code Veronica, 7, Village, Resident Evil 4, Original, Resident Evil 2, Remake, obviously I only played Remake, Resident Evil 1, and as I said earlier, while Resident Evil 1 is the peak of survival horror Resident Evil, Resident Evil 4 Remake is the peak of action horror Resident Evil, and it is also my favorite game in the franchise, so that one takes the number 1 spot. As a side note, we also watched some of the movies, the CGI ones though, not the live action ones. I am not getting anywhere near those, but the CGI movies are fun. There's not too much to say about them, they're just fun action flicks, they're just the characters that we know being cool and epic on a big CGI movie budget. They're just kind of turn your brain off fun. We still gotta watch Dead Island though before we're fully caught up, but we still got some time before Requiem, so I'm sure we'll be fine. And talking about Requiem, I am extremely excited. I'm trying to keep my expectations in check because part of me is kind of worried that the game is a little too ambitious with the whole return to Raccoon City and dual protagonist thing, but everything we've seen so far is pointing at the fact that maybe they actually did it. So many things just look incredibly exciting. Leon is back, obviously, and they have so much here to craft a compelling story with him. Ever since RE2, he's been a very troubled character, dealing with all this trauma and PTSD, and all of it connects back to Raccoon City. And if you then take this whole tagline of this game being a requiem for the dead, a nightmare for the living, it really makes me feel like they're gonna use those elements in the best way possible. They also have a lot of really cool other opportunities here, which they're kind of keeping us in the dark for, like Claire or Jill could even show up because they also have a lot of history there, but both of them showing up or even one of them could possibly already be too much, and then we'll have another Resident Evil 6, and I really don't want that. But someone who I would really like to see again is Ada, mostly because she's always so closely closely related to Leon, and there's also that concept art of her for Village, so I think that she didn't make the final cut of that game because maybe they were starting to write 9, and then they were like, hey, actually Ada would be a better fit for that game. If she's back though, they really need to conclude their whole cat and mouse thing, because I don't want them to retread the same ground over and over again, but I also want her to come back so that they can conclude that storyline finally. But I also don't just want to talk about returning characters, because Grace looks incredibly interesting to me. I really like that she's a more fragile character, like obviously she can handle herself, but the trailers aren't shying away from showing how scared she is. She even reminds me of RE2 Leon in that way, and as messed up as it sounds, I am really excited for a character like that. Her voice acting is incredible. I love the details of her shaking when holding a gun, and especially after Ethan, who just casually reattached his limbs and threw around one-liners, this is looking to be pretty refreshing. I also really like that she's being framed as a protagonist rather than just another sidekick, in the same way that Sheva or Helena were kind of secondary to Chris and Leon in those games, but considering how hard they're pushing Grace in the marketing, I feel like it's safe to say that they're confident in her character. I am just so excited to see them create a new character after everything that they learned from the Ethan Winters saga. I'm also really excited for the gameplay, because I adore RE2 and 4 Remake, so them straight up saying that this is an evolution of those games is extremely exciting. I really like that the remakes aren't just for nostalgia, but that they're actually looking at them to see how they can possibly move forward, and from what they've shown it looks incredible. From the classic zombies being back to Grace having to use ink ribbons, oh my god, I don't know how I didn't mention ink ribbons, but that is like one of my favorite mechanics in the original games, because it's so simple, right? For those who don't know, ink ribbons are basically limited saves, because every time you want to save your game you have to use an ink ribbon, which is an item that you can find in the game, and it is quite limited, but I really love that because it's a horror game, it's tense, and even saving becomes a valuable resource. You need to be careful when to save, you can't just spam your saves. I love that so much, it adds so much weight to the whole experience. Moving on from that though, I also really like how there is this syringe mechanic, so you can stealth kill enemies and take their blood to craft special bullets, which is then another resource to manage, or the way that you can turn off the lights to hide from enemies, how you have both first and third person, how Leon is just aura farming with his little hand axe. I cannot wait for this game. This isn't the early 2010s anymore, where the series felt lost. This is after their insane streak of Resident Evil 2, 3 and 4 Remake, Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 8. The series has found its footing again, so while I don't want to overhype myself, I feel like they're actually going to be able to pull this game off. It looks like a lot, it looks very ambitious, and it could very well crumble under its own ambition, but after everything we've seen, it's hard to not get excited. I guess we'll see how it turns out very soon though. But to end this video, my journey with the series definitely isn't over yet. I'm really excited for the future. There are a lot of plotlines that they could continue. Resident Evil 8 had some interesting setups with Rose and Chris and the BSAA. I'd love to see what Claire or Jill or Rebecca are up to, and I always thought that they dropped Jake Wesker, but they recently brought him up again in an interview, so fuck it, I'm down to see where that goes, especially now that the games are good again. And while Resident Evil 9 does look like some kind of conclusion in some ways, especially with the whole Requiem thing, the Raccoon City thing, outside of that, Resident Evil still has a lot of places to explore, so I am pretty excited and curious to see where they'll take it. And of course, we'll probably have a bunch of remakes too. But personally, I would also really like to go back and play the original Resident Evil 1, 2 and 3 at some point. Or, and this is something that I haven't really talked about yet, but these games are also very replayable with unlockable weapons and obviously mercenaries. But I never got too deep into that aspect as I was always preoccupied with catching up. But now that I'm here, I wouldn't be surprised if I replayed one of these games, maybe get the platinum, mess around in mercenaries mode. This series still has a lot to offer, and I really like that, because it has truly come to mean a lot for me personally. Obviously, I took my sweet time with it. I started the series at the end of 2020, and now it is early 2026, with me finally being caught up. Even if these games are pretty short, you could probably play all of them in like a month or two, but I've been playing these games for 5 years now. That is a long time. I met my girlfriend in 2020, and we started this franchise together only a couple of months later, and in February January of 2026 we're actually moving in together, the same month when Requiem is releasing. Resident Evil has always been there, it's been this experience that we always shared. Even if it was second monitor content for her, at times we'd still constantly be talking about it, discussing it. She helped me write this video, and those are all really incredible memories. Like, yeah, I was very critical of some titles here, and my girlfriend dropped out during Village, but she's right there with me in the Requiem hype. I think that's mostly because Leon is hot though, but I agree, so I can't really blame her. I just love Resident Evil, man. Through the highs and lows, I'm incredibly grateful for this franchise, and that is why I was so excited to make this video right after rolling credits on Village. At parts while writing the script, I was kind of thinking like, why am I even making this? I'm far from the only person that played through every Resident Evil game, especially now with all the Requiem hype, but ultimately it's that personal experience that matters. It's not only about, is this game good or bad, it's about that journey, and I hope I was able to add something meaningful to this video by talking about that aspect. But with that, I am going to wrap it up here. Thank you all so much for watching. Be sure to leave a comment and tell me about your journey with Resident Evil, or just tell me about one of your favorite memories with this series. I know that there are some people out there that have been playing these games since day one of the original release, and that is something truly special, so be sure to share your stories. If you like videos like this, but also reviews and other discussions, be sure to check out my channel. Also leave a like on this video if you enjoyed it. All of that stuff really helps me out. The algorithm can sometimes be an evil resident. That was really cringe. I don't know why I said that. I'm just gonna wrap it up now before I say even stupider stuff. So thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and hopefully I'll see you all again soon.